Welcome to our CEA webinar on the obstacles that Native American voters face. Really excited to have you here. Thanks very much for joining us, especially for such an important topic. A couple of reminders before we get started. The closed caption option is available to you at the bottom. So if you want a visual version of the conversation as it's happening, you can have that. And then also go ahead and provide questions anytime along the way, and I'll curate those so that when we get to the question and answer period, we can go through as many of them as is possible and cover as many of the topics as we can. Let me talk to you a little bit about our program here at the University of Minnesota, at the Humphrey Institute. We do a Certificate of Elections Administration program where you can become a CEA, a Certified Elections Administrator, by a 12-credit program. It's accessible 24 hours a day. It's all online. And we have done a really good job of placing people in really important positions. In fact, people in the state of Colorado are in great positions as a consequence of their CEA training. Some of the classes that we're teaching now include, next slide, please. We have an upcoming class with Maurice Turner. He's starting his class in March, so March 14th. He'll go through the rest of the semester. The CEA program runs by semesters, so we do full semester classes and we do half semester classes. I'm teaching election in the law right now, and that's a full semester class. We have a number of very prominent teachers, people like Matt Masterson and Tammy Patrick, Jennifer Morell, and others. So really exciting programs and classes that we teach, and we want to encourage everybody to learn more about them. Okay, next slide. We have an upcoming webinar. So we do these webinars every other month. Our one in April is on April 19th. And a familiar name, Jennifer Morell, will be doing that presentation. It's 11 a.m. Central Time, so noon Eastern Time. And she's going to be talking about election audits. Of course, she's going to talk about election audits because Jennifer Morell is the worldwide expert on election audits. So what a perfect speaker to come and talk about that. That's both the election audits that we think of sort of post-election, but also how you can audit the work that you do as elections administrators throughout the cycle. So definitely mark your calendar for April 19th so you can be there for Jennifer. All right, let's go to today's speaker. So back to me, there we go. Okay, today we have Jacqueline De León. So Jacqueline is a staff attorney at the Native American Rights Fund. She's also a national expert on election law as it relates to Native American voters. And this is a topic of special interest to me and to our work here at the Colorado Department of State. And I know it's very important to many people associated with the Minnesota Elections Office because they have so many Native American voters in the state of Minnesota. So there's a great connection between this work and the University of Minnesota at the Humphrey Institute. I would just make one note, and that is that Colorado has the sad distinction of being the last state to permit Native Americans to register to vote, and that was in 1970. So there are people who are alive today who could have voted in elections in Colorado in 1970 or before, who were prevented from doing so because they couldn't register. So this is a recent problem and one that we still need to address both through policies and laws And fortunately, we have experts like Jacqueline who can take us through the process of addressing the big things and also the small things that you can do to help Native American voters. So let me pass it along to Jacqueline. Thanks for being here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Let me just get this slideshow up and running. But it's a real pleasure and honor to be here, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to such on-the-ground folks that are actually doing the hard work and sometimes and too often thankless work of running elections across the country. And I am just really excited for the ability to communicate with you honestly about Native Americans across the United States. So first, I think what we're going to do is I'm going to start laying and painting a picture of, unfortunately, the lack of participation and the lack of access of Native Americans to voting across the country. And the reason that I'm going to paint this picture is because I think a lot of folks have assumptions about how elections run, what it means to have an accessible election, and are frankly shocked when they come to realize how difficult, just plainly and unfairly difficult, it is for Native Americans to access the franchise. And where we're going to end up is going to be a series of recommendations to election administrators, you all, on how you can improve access, as well as a call for legislation that right now is pending or was introduced and will be introduced again, that is bipartisan. One of the few voting pieces of legislation that is bipartisan in the House as well as the Senate, to address specifically a lot of the structural issues that impede Native American access. Because when people actually learn sort of how unfairly difficult it is to vote in Indian country, it really calls out for some relief. So, by our best estimates, obviously, you guys know data well, and, census numbers are notoriously difficult. This is likely an undercount, but by our best estimate, 34% of voting age Native Americans are not registered to vote. And among registered voters, Native turnout is 13% lower than the national average for all racial and ethnic groups. So why is it so difficult to vote? So a lot of people, as you're thinking about Native Americans and reservations, maybe you do get this sense of a distant group. Maybe you've heard stories about the lack of infrastructure, the lack of access to clean water, dirt roads. Well, I'm here to tell you that, in fact, that dim picture is probably accurate. Across the country, Native Americans, unfortunately, live in conditions that are woefully inadequate and can be significant distances from other towns. So it is not uncommon for a reservation to be located 20, 30, 40, 50 miles from the nearest border town. It is not uncommon for there to be a lack of infrastructure, roads that can handle often rural and notoriously difficult weather. So our elections are in November, and that can be an especially difficult month. You can imagine that in South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, November is not an exactly easy month to travel. And that's especially true if you don't have a vehicle that has four-wheel drive, if you don't have a vehicle and have a vehicle that can frankly access roads that are still dirt. There is a lack of internet access. I visit quite a few reservations, and as I get onto the reservation, there's a clunk as I get onto the road and my phone loses service. And so that can mean that people won't have phone service, won't have internet access, and the rates of poverty are incredibly high. Surprising to a lot of people is that many of the homes on reservations are just not addressed. And this is going to come up again throughout the presentation, because as election administrators, you can imagine how many difficulties that poses in the election system. And I have sympathy for both sides, right? If you don't have an address, it's difficult for an administrator to place you in the appropriate precinct, but it's also, as you can imagine, incredibly difficult for the voter to register. You're going to have higher rejection rates. You're going to have higher misplaced precincts. You're going to get kicked off the voter rolls more readily. And then, I think there's also a lack of mail. So not only is there not an address, but the U.S. Postal Service is not making deliveries to the door of individuals. Instead, Native Americans rely on post office boxes. Those post office boxes can be just as distant as the border towns. They can be 20, 30, 40, 50 miles away. Those post offices are also inadequate. They will have mail that will take 10, 15 days to arrive. It will also never arrive at all. There will be a lot of misplaced mail, incorrectly placed mail, along with a variety of other challenges with accessing the mail given the distance. People are also going to be sharing those mailboxes along with sharing homes. I cannot overstate enough how inadequate the housing is on Native American reservations. It is not at all uncommon to have 10, 11, 12, 15 people living in a 2, 3, or 4 bedroom home. This is frankly shocking, but it is the reality for many Native Americans across the country. And the reason I know about all these structural factors is because I'm familiar with Indian country, but also because NARF, the organization I'm part of, and the Native American Voting Rights Coalition of a lot of different organizations interested in Native voting, conducted a series of 9 field hearings across Indian country, which I led. And those 9 field hearings sort of asked the questions directly to Native Americans and said, why is it so difficult to vote, right? And asking that question directly to Native Americans, we were all able to discern this list of structural factors that are pervasive across Indian country that make it difficult to vote. So we had, over 100 witnesses sort of attesting. And, despite the differences across Indian country, of which there's many, there's 575 tribes now, 76, federally recognized tribes that vary in size and in location and demographics and geography. These structural factors were alarmingly consistent across the field hearings and across the stories that we hear about Indian country. And all of that research culminated into obstacles at every turn, barriers to political participation faced by Native Americans. That's nearly 200-page report on these factors. And if you want to learn more, the link is here. So structural factors are only part of the story. There is also, unfortunately, pervasive bias and racism that was reported and heartfelt testimony that was given about the contemporary racism that Native Americans face, especially when they try to access the franchise. And so, I think this is a topic that, again, is surprising in its and how blatant and how pervasive it is in Indian country. Border towns, the towns that are nearest to a reservation, can be notoriously difficult. And this can be shocking. And in a sort of state that, is quote unquote liberal, for example, border towns and the behavior that happens in border towns can be shocking to statewide officers, right? And these type of things, unfortunately, happen with consistency, which is what we heard testimony from in the field hearings. So, for example, what you're seeing in the right-hand corner is a winner of the 2020 Halloween costume contest held the weekend before the election and near the Fort Peck Reservation in Glasgow, Montana. And the KKK in that area is notorious and contemporaneously so for being hostile towards Native Americans. The other picture you see of the police officer there was in South Dakota in 2014, outside of the Pine Ridge Reservation, where the polling location that serviced Native Americans, he stationed himself there with his hand on his gun, blocking the doorway, for the entirety, for hours that day. People were deterred from voting because of that. The headline that you see at the bottom is about a clerk in San Juan County, Utah, that committed fraud to backdate a complaint against a Native American that was false, alleging that he did not live in the district, and kicked him off the ballot. A federal judge admonished him for that fraud and reinstated the Native candidate on the ballot. That type of fraud ultimately was not prosecuted, despite the fact that the federal judge had found that there was a fraud, that the election worker had a bias against Native Americans. And so I think that, unfortunately, given this tapestry and the consistency that we see in border towns, we are faced with a problem when it comes to election, when all too often these services are located only in border towns that not only require travel, right, which is sort of what we had seen before, is structurally difficult because of the poor roads, because of the distances, because of the poverty and lack of access to vehicles, but also because when you're going to a town that you don't feel welcome in, it can be incredibly difficult for you. And I think what a polling place located 25, 30 miles away in a place that you don't feel comfortable in is communicating, right? Is that this system is not for you and this system is not welcoming, right? And so I think what we hear a lot from elections officials is that at the end of the day, Native Americans just aren't interested. They don't want to come. We try. We've given we've even gone out there, and our participation rates are really low. And so, this really isn't about an issue of access. It's an issue about apathy. I'll tell you that I have had the pleasure and honor of working with a diverse and expansive array of get out the vote activists across this country, of Native Americans that are incredibly impassioned about voting, and who over and over again tell me that it's these structural factors that keep folks from wanting and being able to engage. And unfortunately, we see, language discrimination, folks that only speak, especially elders, their native language, or election administrators that may be offended or blanch at the idea of native languages that are being spoken in the polling places, as well as I mentioned, intimidation at the polls. So, for example, we heard contemporary stories of, Native Americans that enter the polling place, and there's an absolute hush that comes over. All the workers just turn and stare until that Native American, has finished voting. And then, the chatter resumes once they've left. Those types of behaviors are communicating exactly what they're intended to communicate. So what are some of the policies, additional policies that sort of prey on, but also are subjected to these structural factors? There's quite a few, right? And often these policies are made, frankly, not sort of understanding or keeping in mind the issues that Native Americans face, right? And so they're trying to address maybe a wider issue, right? But aren't taking into account the fact that these will become barriers, making it literally or practically impossible for Native Americans to register and vote. So, for example, a residential address requirement. You can imagine that in a place where there are no addresses on a home, and where Native Americans are sharing a home, 10 to 15 people in that home, they're not going to have proof of a residential address. And say the house is even addressed, right? If you've got 10 to 15 people living in that home, there's one, maybe two people that have paperwork that attests to that address, but the other folks don't. Another big structural or policy that misses Indian country, that's an excellent policy, is motor voter, right? Lots of Native Americans don't have driver's licenses. For example, we did some litigation in North Dakota around IDs that required residential addresses when it was known that there were no residential addresses on some Native homes. And the reason that folks didn't have driver's licenses is because from places like Standing Rock, it can be 50 miles to the nearest DMV. And they don't need those driver's licenses in their everyday reservation lives when often they don't have vehicles to begin with. Right. And so that just is that motor voter just, misses Indian country in a lot of ways. Also, a lot of folks may from underserved populations get, have government services where they also receive reservation or registration opportunities. But Native Americans are often going to miss that, right? Because we have treaty rights that give us fulfillment of those treaty rights. And so we have food commodities or other things that the federal government is providing in fulfillment of those treaty rights, which may mean that Native Americans are not engaging with public assistance. And so they're missing that registration opportunity as well. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, the severe overcrowding in homes just makes it physically difficult for Native Americans to register. And, obviously on the federal form, right, you're allowed to place a map and put your location and say, I live, from crossroads X and X, 2 miles north from the nearest landmarker. And that's supposed to put you in the correct district and precinct. But I think as election administrators know, that can be difficult for the person that's processing the form, and therefore there are errors that are made, and therefore Native American registrations are more likely to be rejected. So policies that also make it harder to vote itself. So ID requirements, right? Let's just talk about the elephant in the room. A lot of people are going to say, okay, I've lost you. She's lost me. Here I am. I was here with you. I'm not actually against ID requirements, right? What I am against is cutting people out based on the types of identification that they actually have access to, right? So, the North Dakota case is a great example. We litigated that case for almost 6 years. And the facts of that case really boiled down to a sentence, which is that the state required IDs to have an address on them when they knew that Native Americans did not have addresses on some of their homes, right? And at the end of the day, a court found that compelling, and we were able to reach a settlement, right? And the problem is, right, when you have IDs, when you only have driver's licenses, when you don't allow for tribal IDs, or you allow for tribal IDs, but you place an address requirement on them, you're just going to have folks that aren't going to have that type of ID through no fault of their own, and that it's not reasonable for them to get that type of ID. And so, I think that's another barrier. Obviously, proof of address requirements is another one. We think that proof of address requirements are wholesale not allowed under the NVRA. And so, but we still see them pop up, with regularity, and we have to testify against them. Prohibitions on same-day registration also make it very difficult for Native Americans to vote. Registration opportunities just don't exist on reservations, right? All the reasons that I already said, that so many folks just don't have registration, right? And so those, if you have to travel, right, 40 miles to go and vote, right, at the nearest county seat, for example, and you don't have the opportunity to also register that day, that's two trips of 40 miles, 80 miles round trip, right? And so same-day registration is vastly overused in Native communities. Limits on how a voter can cast a ballot. If you've only got a very limited number of options, cutting out any of those options is going to make it more difficult. Even though vote by mail is more difficult, some Native Americans utilize it, right? Limit on early voting schedules. Again, because of these long distances, because of weather in November, early voting is really critical to Native communities and all too often not available. And then, obviously, just a lack of opportunity for tribes and a lack of receptiveness for tribes to secure on reservation polling locations that are convenient to tribal communities. And that also communicate, again, that they are constituents that are welcome and that are election administrators are here to serve. So let me pause for a minute and talk a little bit about Native constituents, right? So Native Americans occupy this unique space in the American Republic, right? And it's something that's confusing and something that I think is a little bit uncomfortable for folks, and can be uncomfortable for Native Americans as well, right? At the end of the day, citizenship was conferred upon Native Americans. Native Americans are sovereign nations. We have not relinquished our sovereign status and have communicated with the United States through treaties, right, to establish reservations where Native Americans, unless those powers have been diminished by Congress, remain and retain their sovereignty, right? But the way that this integrates into the American politic is quite simply federalism, right? It's not that hard in the sense that you already are very familiar with the paradigm. States also are sovereign, right? That retain powers and, relinquished, their control in certain respects to the federal government. We also know that those governments come down into smaller and smaller pieces at the county level, at the state level, right? And so we are used to segmenting these different responsibilities and controls when it comes to Native American place in the body politic of America, right? And so Native Americans at the end of the day are United States citizens. We're county citizens, we're state citizens, and we are tribal citizens. I'm a member of the Sleta Pueblo. And, integrating and acknowledging that sovereignty does not diminish, right, that access or right to vote, right? There's a history here where states have said explicitly to Native Americans, if you vote, then you are relinquishing your tribal sovereignty or your tribal membership in the past. And so there's a trauma there of Native Americans being fearful that this is not our system and that participation in this system somehow diminishes tribal sovereignty. But contemporaneously, advocates like myself and many advocates across the country recognize that participation in American system is the best way to safeguard sovereignty. Electing candidates that understand the Native American paradigm is how we control our resources and access, the democracy that America offers us, right? And so we are very passionate about participation in American democracy, and really very, and then, I think passionate about also accessing and participating in local politics, right? A lot of counties, for example, will say Native Americans don't want to participate in our system. They have their system, we have ours. And so, we don't mess with them. But the problem is that Native Americans are in fact county citizens, are in fact entitled to resources, and are in fact entitled to vote, right? And it's often election administrators at that county level that are, residing in border towns or residing in areas that can be hostile to Native Americans. And so I think that there's a friction there that occurs. And we have to be cognizant of it, and we have to look past it. And as election administrators, recognize that Native American constituents are constituents that deserve equal access. And so, long distances and dirt roads are difficult for election administrators to traverse. It is difficult to set up a polling place on a reservation. It is also equally difficult for a Native voter to traverse those distances the other way. Right. And I think that, if they're trying to access the ballot, it's on the election administrator to make that ballot accessible to Native Americans. And so, Native Americans have been and are frankly scarred from a legacy and continuing legacy of failure to provide these opportunities to vote, and an integration and welcoming of voting registration, early voting, and election day opportunities to vote. And so Native Americans, when they go to vote, are frankly nervous, right? They're nervous, they're unsure. They can feel some shame about the fact that they don't readily have an address, that they use a PO box, that the form doesn't really comply to their living situation, that they have to go to a border town that's pretty far, that they hitched a ride with somebody else, and that they're not sure how they're going to get back, right? All of these things make the voting experience just incredibly difficult for Native Americans. It is a time and resource investment that is frankly, I think, unparalleled across the country. And so when a Native voter has shown up at your polling place, they may be distrustful and nervous. So how can election officials increase access to the vote? Well, look, the first step is to call the tribe. Call them up. If you're nervous about it or if you're unsure, NARF is happy to help. We are happy to facilitate that conversation, and I've done it quite a few times. I communicate directly with county officials and with tribal leaders, and we're happy to be a conduit to having a discussion about, hey, where can we find an accessible building or a building that can provide, curbside voting? Where is a place that's secure, that has the locks and the internet access that we need? How do we get there? Who's going to open up the building for us? Can we have that building for free? The answer to all of those things is usually yes, right? And that brainstorming on reservation voting locations is something, and it's the first step to establishing an on-reservation polling place, right? And the second thing is to actually provide those services equitably, right? There's 10 days of early voting, say. Well, Native Americans should get 10 days of early voting. There's registration opportunities that occur just at the county seat. Hey, that county seat's 50 miles away. We should provide on-reservation a registration. There's and then election day. I know you have a limited number of election administrators, right? Well, work to get a person certified so that they can provide on reservation election day services, not from not just the week before the election or the days leading up to the election, but actually on election day. And part of that is foresight, right? You got to request the equipment and the budgets necessary to service Native populations. And I know that across Indian country, we always get we don't have the machines. There's only so many machines, and so we can't do it. Well, if you request a machine and if you get a machine early enough, right? If you get a budget early enough, if you work with tribes, or work with other organizations, where allowed. If the machine is a $2,000 expense, right? Maybe you can work together to find a way to cover that machine, right? There's a lot of things that are investments and a lot of unspent HAVA funds sometimes, right? Things that folks can do to make sure that they have the resources necessary and the budgets necessary to service Native populations with intention. And so other additional ways is to hire Native poll workers, right? And pay them equitable wages. So we've seen people hire Native poll workers and pay them 10 cents on the dollar relative to non-Native poll workers. Don't do that, right? Pay them. But also, Native poll workers have the advantage of being there, right? It's not a 50-mile drive. They live there. And they can, when the weather's good, get the equipment that they need and go, and they can set up and make those ballots accessible to their communities. They'll be a friendly face that the community recognizes, and they have a lot of advantages. You can, another thing to keep an eye out, train poll workers to recognize and accept tribal IDs, right? We have had instances where tribal IDs are state recognized under state law and allowed, but the poll workers don't recognize the tribal IDs and aren't willing to accept that. And, that might be less true for a reservation polling place, more true in the cities, right? So make sure that all of the folks in your urban areas recognize and are familiar with tribal IDs as an acceptable form of ID when it is allowed, right? And understand that sometimes, right, you can have a government issued document as a secondary form of ID, or two government issued documents to prove identification. And those include tribally issued documents, right? Tribes are governments and they issue documents to tribal members. Again, as I have been sort of mentioning the entire time, understanding the addressing and severe crowding issues, right? So there are times where Native Americans, when filling out their registration form, may put the local FedEx office, right, as their address. That is not fraud. That is not something that is, they're not trying to be cagey, right? What is part of their experience, that is how they get mail, right? That is the address that they are using on a daily basis and fill out for other documents, right? That does not mean, and they're doing it because either their home doesn't have an address or because they're living in a home that has 10 to 15 people and they're not the ones that are, that the lease is under, right? And so they don't have any other identification that has an address on it. So they're not being cagey. They're not trying to circumvent anything. They're just literally presenting themselves as they do in their everyday lives. And then also understand, when you're trying to cure a ballot, right? When you're trying to check a registration roll, Native Americans are not going to be the most responsive, right? They don't have access to a telephone services. Like I said, the reception can be poor or the plans are exorbitantly expensive. Same with internet. And also a lack of access to mail, right? That isn't to say that you shouldn't try all those avenues, right? And that you should continue to sort of reach out, but don't be afraid of leaving a message, right? With somebody else that isn't the person that answered the phone to say, say somebody, I'm looking for Robert. And somebody else, this is the election administration office. If you could have Robert call me back to, whatever, to cure the ballot, right? There's a network of resources that are always shared. So, some of these issues, I understand that there's only so much that election administrators can do. And sometimes we need federal legislation to address these more structural issues. Currently, in the last Congress and for the last couple of years has been introduced and will likely be introduced again, is the Native American Voting Rights Act, which is a bipartisan piece of legislation. Republican Tom Cole and Democrat Sharice Davids are co-sponsors in the House. In the Senate, Senator Murkowski has praised the Native American Voting Rights Act. And what this does is it mandates on-reservation polling place access. It allows voters living on Indian lands to designate a tribal building to register, pick up, or drop off a ballot. And it requires federal agencies like IHS to become NVRA registration sites, right? So Indian Health Services provides health services to Native Americans across Indian country, and they are a good resource and point of contact for Native Americans. And so we want them to become basically the motor voter of Indian country, right? And it mandates the acceptance of tribal IDs. So those don't become at the discretion of every state, but that every state has to accept tribal IDs as a voter ID. And then I'll also pause here for a moment and say, there are also instances in states where NAVRAs have been proposed, and in Washington state, NAVRA has been passed, right? Again, to allow, Washington state, for example, does all vote by mail, and it allows the tribe to pick up and drop off a ballot at a designated building and register at a designated building because of those addressing concerns in Washington state, right? I think that every state has the opportunity to pass its own NAVRA, to recognize the deficiencies in Native communities and pass legislation aimed at providing on-reservation polling place registration and early voting access. And I think that, it's helpful for election administrators that are supportive to testify or to propose this type of legislation. It goes a really long way if at a local level, there's an administrator that is invested and willing to speak to state legislatures about the need for NAVRA or a statewide NAVRA. So this is my last slide. I think what this slide represents is that Native Americans are too often left out of the conversation and our consciousness, right? This was a big joke and meme around Indian country, just so you know. The something else are the Native Americans, right? These something else. We are something else. But I think that, what kind of this slide represents, like I said, is just this lack of attention and care paid to Native Americans who are Americans and citizens. And so I just, want you all to know, as election administrators, you hold a tremendous amount of power. You have the ability to make inroads, to provide access, to make the decisions at a local level that invite Native Americans to participate, as opposed to keep Native Americans out. And I just encourage you all to reach out to me. If you have, I should have put it on the slide, but I can put it in the chat, my contact information. I'm always happy to help. We have a team here at NARF that know very well how to facilitate Native communities and election administrators contacts if necessary, although you're more than welcome to do it on your own. And we are eager to sort of bring this attention to the fore and work with election administrators to try and solve the problem. So thank you all so much for your attention and the opportunity to present today.
Hey, thanks, Jacqueline. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. If you don't mind, I want to tell our story for a moment. So in Colorado, as I mentioned, we don't have a storied history of assisting Native Americans to become active voters. But over the last 15 years, we've really tried. And we've developed relationships with the 2 federally designated tribes. In the last couple of years, we've hired Native Americans living on reservation land to be to promote elections, our elections, as well as elections of the tribes themselves, encouraging Native Americans living on reservation land to register to vote, and talking about where you can vote, when you can vote, how you get a ballot in the mail, how you can vote in person if you want to. We've opened polling places for early voting and on election day at the 2 designated tribal headquarters in the southwest corner of Colorado and in La Plata and Montezuma counties. And we're working with our tribal partners right now to set up extended early voting to get them more days, and then also talking to them about a way that we can get people registered to vote in a more automatic way. So you mentioned the IHS. We're also just thinking, how can we understand who the population is so that we can get people registered? Because we are pretty proud of our back-end AVR in Colorado, automatic voter registration, which really helps to facilitate getting people registered, but it misses people. And so we're trying to think of ways that we can catch the folks that are not in those groups and are readily registered in those manners. So we're trying these, and they're all little things, if we just gave this little thing or that little thing, and it really is within the power of a county clerk or a state office to help facilitate that kind of effort. So I encourage everyone here who's a city clerk, a county clerk, someone who has a Native population in their jurisdiction to reach out and figure out, is there a way that I can help that population? Maybe there's an easy thing that you can do that you don't even know about. And it just it starts with a conversation. All right, so we got some great questions. So let me send a couple of those to you, Jacqueline. First, Dr. Linda Frizzell, who's actually a professor in the public health department at the University of Minnesota and is herself a Native American who teaches at the university. She is expressing concern with the census data categorizing Native Americans with other Native populations like Alaskan Natives and Mayan Aztec populations who don't fit into the traditional definition of Native Americans. And she's worried not so much about sort of the racial designation as much as how that affects that group's political status. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting, especially off of that last slide, whether you have thoughts on this sort of broader designation of the everyone else category and how that affects political power for Native Americans.
Yeah, thanks. So census is not my total purview, although I am, we've got some really great census experts here at NARF, right? And we have been really invested, like you said, in sort of those categories and being able that we can actually sort of discern out who is Native American, who's Alaska Native, who is federally recognized, and all these sort of different categories. And so we have a census working group that is providing commentary and feedback on the form. And in fact, that process is undergoing now. If you're interested in that process, feel free to reach out to me and I can talk to you a little bit more. I can connect you with that census working group that is really invested, like you say, in sort of making sure that those categories accurately reflect and can gather information. Native Americans' political status exists independent of the the census, right? So, I mean, Native Americans also have their own membership roles and know who's in their community. And so I think like those types of data, when tribes want to share them, it is up to the tribe to share that data, but that data exists within tribes. And so they have a sense of how many people are living in their communities as well. I think that what that census data really is tied to is resources, allocation of resources, right? Is allocation of, the number of people in a community that will get a piece of, infrastructure funding or, health funding or all these different categories. And so it's really important for us to be accurately counted. And right now, and especially in the last census, we know that there was a radical undercount because of the pandemic and, cancellation of, door-to-door counting, which given the lack of residential mail delivery in Indian country was hugely problematic. And so we are being under-resourced.
Just difficult problems to overcome.
Yeah.
So on the more positive side, so Lonnie Skrinkner asks, does the presence of Deb Haaland at as Secretary of the Interior help with some of these situations at all? Is there a nexus between the Department of Interior and the kind of work that you're doing and that we've been talking about?
So Auntie Deb, as she's known to Indian country, is a wonderful, beacon and resource for all of us. I think she does actually turn a lens to quite a few Native American issues. For example, missing and murdered Indigenous women, especially on federal lands, the boarding school crisis and its continuing legacy in Indian communities. She's actually sort of doing the hard work of digging in and being accountable to those atrocities. But I think voting takes place really at a local and county level, and the Department of Interior doesn't necessarily have a lot of jurisdiction. She has been helpful. For example, we've been working with federal agencies to try and get them to voluntarily accept designation of the National Voter Registration Act registration designation, and she has gotten 2 Native American colleges that are under her purview: Haskell Nations University and SIPI, Southwest Polytechnic Institute, to accept designation. So she's doing pretty much all she can, but her purview is limited.
Haskell, I used to teach at a university in Kansas and lived in Lawrence, and Haskell was just down the road, and I remember giving a talk there once.
Great.
A great university. So we had a couple of questions about vote by mail. So this is sort of a multifaceted question. So is the 7 states that provide all voters a ballot by mail, so all registered voters or active registered voters, depending upon how the state categorizes, get ballots in the mail. Is that sort of a step forward, or does that create some other issues? I mean, how does vote by mail
Yeah,
benefit or
yeah.
create challenges for Native voters?
So I think this is an important conversation, and one that I think we've actually pushed back against sort of this idea that only vote by mail is adequate, right? At the end of the day, more voting opportunities benefit everybody, right? So, accessibility, providing, mailing folks that have addresses, ballots, right? Like those kind of things, we're supportive of course. We want to sort of provide as many avenues for voting as possible. But what we can't do is do those exclusively in a way that cuts Native communities out. So, a lot of those states have vote centers, right? And it's important that those vote centers actually are on reservations, right? And accessible to Native people, especially because Native Americans have a lot of difficulty accessing the mail, right? And then, I think in NAVRA, the Native American Voting Rights Act, there's that prescription that tribes be able to designate a building that's used to pick up, drop off, and register, right? If you're in that precinct, you can use that building to register. If you're not in that precinct, you can use that building to pick up and drop off a ballot, and you can revert back to the sort of grid system to sort of specify where you are. But those kind of accommodations and thinking about the Native population is really important. One thing that I think I accidentally skipped over in my presentation is ballot collection, right? I know that hits a lot of buttons again, right? This idea of ballot harvesting, the boogeyman, everything. Look, I understand what those concerns are, that somebody's going to go in and strong arm a bunch of seniors into voting the way that they want to vote. But we have to also think about Native Americans that live in a rural area, don't have residential mail delivery, can't drop off that ballot out their front door, that don't have access to a vehicle. And so it's just regular course of business that Native Americans go around, pick up everybody's mail, drive it the 20 or 30 miles to the post office and drop it off collectively, right? Or they go to the post office, everybody gives them their mailbox key. The one person that's driving those 30 miles is going to go and pick up mail for everybody and drop it off to everybody. These aren't nefarious things. They are trying to deal with their lack of resources, right? And when elections come around, people, organizations, nonprofits that have roadworthy vehicles, right, that have four-wheel drive, will go out in a winter storm and go around and pick up ballots for folks and drive them back to the county seat. And those are effective GOTV things that people do because of the lack of access of mail. And so, it's a balancing of interests and a recognition that people's realities are different.
Really important issues. I'll note that that question, the sort of combo question, was from Dan Goodrich, who's a student in our CDA program and very politically active. And then Phil Kiesling, who is the current executive director, I think the interim executive director of the Vote at Home Foundation, which is obviously advocates for vote by mail and has been really important in sort of the evolution of vote by mail in the United States. And Phil is a former Secretary of State in Oregon, I believe. And Chris Moen asks, how involved is tribal leadership? So taking this the other direction. So we were talking about elections administrators talking to tribal leaders about some of these issues. Is there an active effort to get tribal leadership talking to their local elections officials or state election officials to begin sort of communicating the needs of local populations, like voting locally and having expanded voter registration efforts and so forth? Is that something that's also going on and that's being prioritized?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the road can go both ways. But, and I'll say, Native Americans and Native tribal governments are under-resourced, as a lot of, local governments are, and are often dealing with, a variety of emergencies, right? And they don't have expertise in elections, right? So I think that in a lot of ways, when the election administrator reaches out, it's like incredibly appreciated, right? Because, their wheelhouse is varied and their attention is turned to a lot of administrative things day to day in the tribe, not necessarily the sort of administrative things that election administrators think about daily, right? And so I think that, certainly, and there are certainly some tribes that are incredibly active, right? Navajo Nation has, been actively reaching out. There are other tribes that sort of, make communications with county clerks, and unfortunately those communications are rebuffed, right? Their requests for on-reservation polling places are denied. Their requests for early registration opportunities are denied. And, I think that can also sour a tribe on sort of reaching out, and it can go a really long way to know that there's a friendly voice on the other side.
So let me combine a couple of questions, and this will probably be our last one. So a number of people have asked in various ways. This is an isolated population with limited accessibility to internet and local television and that kind of thing. What communication options are there for local elections administrators or local governments to reach out to Native populations when you don't have sort of some of those traditional abilities to get to people? Yeah,
so there's a variety, actually. So one is a great resource is always the tribe itself, right? They often have a website that is, or a community page that is checked with some frequency, right? And that's a great place to place election administration information. And again, Native Americans don't have internet access, but they do drive to the local gas station or library or tribal administration building to access Facebook. We always laugh at sort of like how much Facebook access there is in Indian country, despite the fact that nobody has internet. And it's because folks are, they make the active effort to visit those few community pages that are important to them. So those are great resources. Other ones, and that's just some people, obviously it's still difficult for a lot of people. Actual physical flyers still work, right? Folks are in places that people are visiting. So in tribal administration buildings, in Indian health services clinics, and in other sort of community buildings and spaces, you can put actual physical flyers. And a lot of folks listen to the radio. So there are still tribal channels, and there's local radio stations that folks are actively listening to.
Great. All right. Well, again, I really want to thank you for taking time to come and talk to us. It's not often that we get an expert on such a sort of niche topic in the larger panoply of elections administration. Usually we're dealing with these, sort of big, how do we do this kind of elections administration question? But this is a very special opportunity to come and understand this group of people better and how we can provide those services. So thank you again very much. Jacqueline.
Let me put my email in the chat.
I was going to go to as well. So you can reach out to Jacqueline by going to the Native American Rights Fund page, which is an easy find if you Google her. And she has an easy email address, which is jdeleon@narf.org. So narf.org, jdeleon. So feel free to reach out and she can answer your more specific questions if you have them. All right, well, thank you. Let me once again kind of remind you of the program. So this is sponsored by the Certificate in Elections Administration program. We want to really encourage you to sign up. You can take a course just because you're interested, or you can sign up for the entire program and get a 12-hour credit so you can earn your Certificate of Elections Administration. Next slide, please. This is where you can go to learn more. You can go to the HHH CEA program. If you put in CEA, University of Minnesota, it comes right up. You can apply for the larger program in August of this year, but you can also just try out a class if you're interested. Next slide. We do have a class starting in March if you're interested in election security. And then, in fact, we even have an election security focus. So if you were interested in election security classes, and specifically, we do offer a couple of different classes in those, and you can get an election security focus within the CEA program. And next slide, our upcoming webinar is Jennifer Morell in April 19th, talking about election audits. And that's the sort of world of election audits, both those that come after an election, but also the kinds of election audits we do every day in elections administration. All right, well, thanks again to Jacqueline. And there's some more links to information. You can find a recording of this event in the next day or two on the University of Minnesota webpage at Native American Voting. So feel free to stop by if you want to go back and look at those specific options you have to help with outreach. Thanks again, and we will see you in April.